Hey guys, I thought I would make a really quick video because so many people are concerned about what they're saying are missing and disappeared votes and a 20 million of missing votes in the election. And also the question of whether Starlink was involved in counting votes. So on the Starlink question, I am not a tech expert, but I can tell you that having dealt with this when I was in local news after the 2000 election, when you heard some of the same conspiracy theories about voting machines, flipping votes, etc. There could be individual instances where somebody went in, put their card through the voting machine, and it came out wrong, and they noticed it and went back in and voted. You know, machines are fallible. I can barely make my phone always work. But you should really know that these voting machines are not networked to the internet. They're just not. And there is no one national set of voting machines that all work together and are networked together. That's just not a thing. The only thing voting machines are generally plugged into is the wall. And while, some states do send their, their data, the results of the election through an email, to the internet that way, that's not coming out of the machines. The machines are not networked to the internet. So I've seen no evidence that Starlink had any role in counting any votes. Yes, Starlink is Elon Musk's magic machine, that's now really involved in our Defense Department. That is something you should be worried about. The fact that this guy's a defense contractor and Starlink literally controls whether or not people in Ukraine can get the internet and their satellites work. Like, that's a problem. And he has way too much power and had way too much power in this election. But this video of Joe Rogan saying that Elon Musk knew 4 hours before the election that it was over, that's probably because he was doing what the polling directors at places like ABC, CBS, and NBC are doing, right? They're looking at the returns. And, before a race is actually called, what you have are people looking at the returns as they are on the probabilities based on what's left. So I'm quite sure because he owns a tech company, they were doing the same thing. They were looking in advance the same way the Associated Press does and Reuters does and ABC and NBC do, where they can pretty much see where the race is going and make a call on who's going to win each state based on the number of votes that are still outstanding, what those votes look like. Do they look very red or do they look very blue? These are things that even news organizations do. So he wasn't saying he knew who was going to win because he absolutely knew. It's that he saw the probabilities, and sometimes networks will wait. Like, we at NBC will be very slow at making calls sometimes because the guy who runs our, that operation inside NBC is very careful and doesn't want to go out there and jump out there and be wrong and mislead people or get people who are still voting and who still have time to vote, discourage them from voting. So there's a reason that networks wait and don't call it. But Elon Musk is not a news network and he's not a news organization. He's just a Twitter troll who owns Twitter now and who can go and brag to Joe Rogan that he and Dana White already knew because they were looking at the probabilities the way, the way the networks do. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that. And when it comes to this missing 20 million votes or missing 15 million votes, it is true that as of now, Donald Trump is undervoted. He's gotten about 2 to 3 million votes fewer in this current election than he did in 2020 when he lost. And Kamala Harris, as of little day after the election, had like 15 million fewer than Joe Biden. But hold your horses. That is not election theft. It's because California, which is the biggest state in the union and the most populous state in the union, hasn't turned in their numbers yet. The California vote is super slow. They take forever. Sometimes they take like 2 weeks. Arizona is also not completed in terms of probability now is that Ruben Gallego won it. So they're awarding that to him based on the probability of what's left. But they even said going into this that Arizona could take 10 to 12 days to finish counting their votes. So until all the votes are counted, exit polls don't tell you how many people voted. These are estimates. We know exactly how many early votes came in. Those numbers are definitive. We have them. We know how many absentee ballots in the most places came in, but some states are still counting those. So it's going to take a while before we know what the total popular vote is. We don't know that answer yet as of today. This is the Sunday after the election that I'm making this video. So don't think that the 15 million missing votes are the final total. They're not. Votes are still being counted. And in the biggest state in the union, California, which is as big as a country, I mean, California could be its own country. If it was a country, it'd be like the seventh largest country economy in the world. Not country, but economy in the world. It's a giant, enormous country-sized state. So those tens and tens of millions of people who voted, they just haven't counted that yet. So give it time. You'll see what the popular vote is. And what I think you're going to find is that overall, insanely enough, given the stakes in this election, turnout was down versus 2020. And I want to explain why that could be as well. In 2020, which was the largest voter turnout in since Obama, everyone was basically at home because we were in the middle of the pandemic. We were in the middle of the pandemic and people were sitting home, and states that don't normally let you vote absentee by mail let people do it. So states like Pennsylvania that have never had early voting or absentee were allowing everyone to vote absentee if they wanted to be safe and not go into a physical poll because of the pandemic and the spread of COVID was such a risk. So states like Michigan, states like Arizona, states like Pennsylvania, see where I'm going, swing states, North Carolina, states that didn't have a tradition of large-scale absentee voting. By the way, New York never did. New York, it used to be you had to have an excuse to vote absentee. When I was full-time in New York and voting in New York, you had to go in and fill out an affidavit as to why you wanted to vote absentee. It wasn't no excuse. But in 2020, in that election, basically the whole electorate was sitting home, getting mailed a ballot to their house, which there's no surprise that that produces higher turnout. If our whole country was just absentee voting like Utah and Colorado have universal absentee, we would have higher turnout, because states that have total absentee voting have higher turnout because you just get a ballot in the mail. You have time to sit down, think about it, do your research, figure out who you want to vote for. It actually makes people more engaged. The reason that people who are voting rights reformers, people who want to reform the system, want there to be more absentee along with automatic voter registration. If you didn't have to go stand in line at the DMV and you just automatically were registered to vote when you turned 18, or when you got your, turned 18 and you have a social security card, if you have a social security card, you also are registered to vote. Can you imagine? It would be so much easier, and you wouldn't have voter suppression because you wouldn't have parties gaming who gets to register, who's registered, and who's not, which Republicans did aggressively this year. I mean, this year you had so much suppressive activity between Republicans challenging people's right to vote, whether they were on the voter rolls, people showing up and being told they weren't on the rolls, and then having to vote with a provisional ballot. That actually did happen, but it didn't happen at the scale that would make up for 20 million votes. There just wasn't that scale, right? And those things could be fixed. And then the provisional ballots also in some states haven't been counted. So once those votes are counted, that will add to the totals as well. So what you're seeing now is not the total popular vote. It's not something to panic over. And there's just no evidence. I've gone through, because so many people have DM'd me and asked, and I've had cousins and friends calling me and saying, was this thing stolen? There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that anything happened other than what is obvious that happened, which is that Trump voters were on one and were determined to return him to office come what may. Instead of not voting early, which he had originally told them in 2020 that early voting was fraud inherently, so they didn't do it. And he told them absentee voting was inherent fraud, so they didn't do it. This year, he switched his message and said vote early. So Republicans actually caught up to Democrats in early vote. And then it was a matter of who was going to thug it out on Election Day. And in Election Day voting, because absentee skewed a little bit Democratic, early vote was basically a tie, which is not normal. It's usually overwhelmingly Democratic, but Republicans almost always do better on Election Day anyway, especially since in the Trump era, he's told them that's the only way to validly vote. And their operation of getting these dude bros from the podcast bros and the angry young men and the NCEL types to vote, he got them out in droves. And let's just be clear, the thing that mainly happened, white voters. White voters came out in droves, and a majority of them, they were 70+% of the electorate, and they voted hard for Trump. And there was slightly more brown and slightly more black male voters, but not enough to flip it. It was white voters. They wanted Trump, and they got him. They got what they asked for, and now we're going to find out how that works out for them. That's how it is. and working class voters too. They wanted Trump because they thought he could fix the economy, and they're going to get what they asked for.